Breaking news. President Joe Biden has endorsed sweeping Supreme Court reform. I'm Marc Elias, along with Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
This morning, President Joe Biden outlined his plan for Supreme Court reform. It has three components. The first is an enforceable ethics code for the justices. The second is a constitutional amendment to limit presidential immunity. And the third is to institute term limit for Supreme Court justices. Marc, let's walk through these and break these down. First, an enforceable ethics code for U.S. Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, this is a really big one, and I'm glad it's where you started because in some ways, this is the thing that will make the biggest difference, I think, of everything. Let's back up. There's a video of me interviewing Senator Sheldon Whitehouse recently that we'll put in the show notes. And one of the points I made to the senator is that if I tried to buy him dinner for, say, $100, it would violate the Senate ethics rules and he'd have to pay. So the idea that we have justices who are flying around the country, getting free vacations, free tickets to stuff, and people don't even know about it is an absolute travesty. It is unacceptable. The president has laid out that he believes that there needs to be an ethics code that requires transparency. This needs to be an enforceable ethics code. I would go further and say it should not just be an ethics code of transparency, but it should be an ethics code that prohibits these gifts. We don't necessarily need to know more about the $1 million gifts that our justices are getting. We need them not to be getting them. He also points out that there needs to be recusal standards in these circumstances. These are common sense measures. I'm glad to see that President Biden has adopted these and is going to promote these in the remainder of his term. And it has been far too long that the justices have taken advantage of their privileged status of not being bound to these things.
Marc, when all of these investigations into Justice Thomas and Justice Alito started coming out, I think it surprised most people that the Supreme Court didn't have enforceable ethics standards, but every single other level of federal judges do. What does that say about how the court is set up, that there wasn't ethics standards to begin with? But I think more so, what does it say about our moment right now that we feel like this is the most crucial reform, but we don't know if it's possible, if it'll pass in Congress?
So look, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it tells us a lot about the place that the Supreme Court has been in our society in the past, that we haven't needed to have these reforms. There has not been a sense that justices in the past had abused their power with respect to ethics, and it speaks to the moment we're in that that is no longer the case. That there have been real questions raised, real concerns raised about the ethics of justices on the Supreme Court, and not just whether they are accepting gifts, not just whether they are being transparent, but whether it is creating an actual or appearance that those gifts may be influencing the outcome of decisions. I'm not saying that they are, but there has certainly been a concern, a public spectacle or specter of that possibility. And you cannot have a fair administration of justice if there is not a perception of the fair administration of justice. And then finally, I want to, Paige, address head on kind of your last point. In the mid-1990s, the Congress of the United States adopted sweeping gift reform for themselves. Okay. And this was a bipartisan effort. Republicans were in control of Congress. Democrats worked with them. The sense was that members of Congress should not be accepting gifts. Prior to that, there had been what was referred to as the Ethics in Government Act, which was also a bipartisan effort to put in place disclosure. Since then, we have seen many, many bipartisan efforts to clamp down on gifts and ethics in the Congress, in the executive branch. Why is it that at this moment in time, when you would think that Congress should be eager to put in place a series of ethics reforms on the judiciary, on the Supreme Court justices, that are not nearly as strict as the ones they have on a bipartisan basis subjected themselves to? Why is it that you see Republicans like Mike Johnson, the insurrectionist speaker, come out of the box and say this is dead on arrival? I think it really speaks to the moral bankruptcy and the political moment that we are in right now, that Republicans find this kind of thing not just objectionable, but something that they are going to stand up against.
Mark, Biden's second proposal is a constitutional amendment to limit presidential immunity. Now, this is in direct reaction to the Supreme Court's ruling just earlier this month that presidents have almost absolute immunity for official acts of office. What's your take on this proposal?
Yeah, so I think this is great. I think it's necessary. I think it's unfortunate that the Supreme Court ruled the way it did on presidential immunity, but it is needed that there is a swift amendment to the Constitution that takes away this ridiculous form of presidential immunity. It should also, by the way, make clear that presidents can't pardon themselves. And boy, do I have good news for everybody, because Congressman Joe Morelli from the great state of New York has already introduced an amendment that would do this. And the way I know that, Paige, is because Democracy Docket has covered this. And if you are not already a subscriber to Democracy Docket, make sure you do that right now. The link is in the show notes below. You'll get a free daily and weekly newsletter, and you would know that there is already a constitutional amendment been proposed by Democrats in the Congress. I hope the president picks that up and uses that as the foundation for what is needed here. It is a common sense measure that Congressman Morelli has proposed. And again, it is hard to understand why Republicans would oppose taking away from presidents absolute immunity to do all kinds of awful things, like Donald Trump's lawyers said in the Supreme Court it would cover, assassinating their political opponents, staging coups, and the like. So, I don't hold out a lot of hope that Republicans will do the right thing, but they should.
Mark, obviously, passing a constitutional amendment has a much higher threshold than just passing legislation like an enforceable ethics code. What do you think the possibility is in this political moment to get 2/3 of both chambers of Congress and then 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify an amendment like this?
Look, I don't think this is going to happen soon, right? Like, I mean, I'm not unrealistic about the political moment we are in. Right now, the political moment we're in is one in which, the Republicans are complete sycophants for Donald Trump. And so if Donald Trump wants to be a dictator for a day, they are in favor of presidents being dictators. If Donald Trump wants to replace the entire federal bureaucracy or large portions of it with Project 2025, something else that Democracy Docket has covered extensively, and replace the federal bureaucracy with his political supporters, they'll be in favor of that. And so, look, they're not going to support this. But here's the deal, Paige. The politics of this can change really, really quickly, because when Kamala Harris is sworn in as the next president of the United States next January 20th, it may be that Republicans all of a sudden decide that they don't want there to be absolute presidential immunity. When Donald Trump is disgraced in defeat electorally one more time, the hold that he has on his coalition may loosen. And you may see a restoration of a more sensible approach to these things. So do I think we're going to get this amendment passed to the Constitution between now and just fewer than 100 days from now? No, I don't think we will. But these amendments oftentimes take months or years. And I think that we should be working towards this amendment in the months and years to come.
Mark, Biden's first two proposals seem to codify what were already the standards, right? That judges should have enforceable ethics codes, that presidents shouldn't have absolute immunity. His third proposal is probably the most...
As if that's crazy, by the way, Paige.
Right. As if these are such radical ideas that judges should have ethics rules that they follow and that presidents can't just do whatever they want, that there are boundaries for everyone to act. Right. But Biden's third proposal is term limits for the U.S. Supreme Court, which is maybe actually the most radical departure from how we understand the court to operate, right? Like, we always learned that the Supreme Court had lifetime appointments. It was important for justices to have lifetime appointments. But now Biden is suggesting that justices serve for 18-year terms and then step down.
Yes and no. So the president didn't exactly lay out the mechanics of this in his op-ed earlier. But let me tell you, Paige, how I think he's thinking about this. Yes, the Constitution says that justices have lifetime tenure. Okay? So I don't think that he can undo that. But it doesn't say what kinds of cases those justices get to hear. So bear with me. 99% of the cases that go to the US Supreme Court go on discretionary review. What does that mean? That means the court can take them or not take them. There are a handful of cases that go up by virtue of the US Constitution itself automatically to the Supreme Court. But those are really, really, really few and far between. It's like lawsuits between states. Okay. It's like these really, really rare things that come up. So I think the way this would be done, at least one proposal, is that the justices would serve for 18 years. Every 2 years, there'd be a new justice appointed. And after 18 years, the justice would go on senior status. Now, you haven't taken away their salary. You haven't said they're not a justice. They are still a justice. But the cases they would hear would now be limited to just these cases of original jurisdiction under the Constitution. So, for example, if New York and New Jersey sue each other, then those would go before all of the justices, not just the 9, but all of those justices, because they haven't lost their lifetime tenure. But the majority of the cases, the overwhelming majority of the cases that go up on discretionary review would only be heard by we'll call them active justices, the justices in that 18-year window. And so I think that or something like that, again, President Biden has not spelled this out, and there are a number of different proposals that sort of achieve the same thing, would not run afoul of the Constitution, because the existing the justices after 18 years would still be in good standing. They'd still be justices on the Supreme Court. There would just be a distinction on which cases they would hear versus which cases other people would hear. Again, this is one proposal. You know who spelled this proposal out? Was Sheldon Whitehouse, in a prior episode of an interview that I did with him for Defending Democracy, which is our flagship podcast here at Democracy Docket, and it is on our YouTube channel and in the show notes below. I hope everybody watches.
Marc, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the system of senior judges who come in on cases every so often, they don't hear every single case, that exists in other levels of the federal judiciary right now, right?
It absolutely does. And, again, a lot of this is really, as a lawyer, frankly, kind of unfortunate that we need. It is unfortunate that we are in this moment where we need to make these structural reforms rather than allowing common sense among the current justices, allowing to prevail. And, it would be better if we have not had the kind of turmoil and scandal or controversies that we've had. But that is the world in which we have been placed, right? We are here not because we necessarily wanted to be, but because we have had a system in which the Supreme Court has become very activist. It has overturned a number of well-settled precedent. It has at the same time had justices who have become embroiled in controversies of their own making. Let's be clear, of their own making, involving large gifts they've received, things that have not been reported as they should be, the flag flying practices of some of the justices' families, and other such things. So, I give real credit to President Biden that in his remaining months in office, he is prioritizing something that is a really necessary thing to preserve democracy going forward.
Marc, what do you think are President Biden's motivations to work on this issue now? Obviously, the problems facing the court we have known about for years. Yes, we've had a particularly explosive Supreme Court term this past year, but these issues were known when Biden was a senator, when he was vice president, in the first few years while he was president. Why now, in his last 6 months in office, focus on these reforms?
So look, I think there are two competing impulses with President Biden, and you've seen both of them. The first is he's an institutionalist. As you point out, he was in the Senate for a very long time. He chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee. He cares enormously about the federal judiciary as an institution and its independence as a co-equal branch of government. And so I think he was loath to move unless he felt like he absolutely had to. Not politically. The thing about this, Paige, realizes that he's not facing the voters again. So he's not doing this for political reasons. He's doing this because he is motivated that it's the right thing to do, which brings me to the second impulse. President Biden cares enormously about democracy. He cares enormously about the rule of law. He cares enormously about ensuring that we continue to have free and fair elections and a court that is not under the influences of big money and the like. He wants to make sure that we have a checks and balances system that is necessary to have a vibrant democracy. So I think as he approaches his final months in offices, he is doing this for all the right reasons. He resisted it till it became unescapably clear that the Supreme Court of the United States has put itself in this position. No one made those justices accept large gifts. No one forced them not to report them. No one embroiled them into the controversies them find themselves about the conduct of their family and how flags are flown or how they, communicated around the January 6th insurrection. These are all things that the court did to itself, and it failed to remedy itself. So Joe Biden deserves an enormous amount of credit in using these last months of his office, using the credibility of his office, using the political capital he has to do the right thing for the American people. And that is what is motivating him. And it is the reason why everyone in Congress and in the states needs to pick up this cause and set their partisan interests aside and follow his lead to protect the court from itself, protect the court from the undermining of popular opinion and legitimacy that it's undergone, and to protect democracy. Thank you, everyone, for joining this special edition of Democracy Docket. Please make sure you are subscribed to our free daily and weekly newsletters. We'll see you next time.